Hello everyone and welcome to week 11. So after this week, only 4-ish more weeks worth of class. So we're almost there, which brings us to something that's important to talk about this week. This is the last week of class that has 2 chapters. I do this intentionally. I try to get through the class. I know sometimes it's busy. Basically, we have to have 11 out of 15 weeks with 2 chapters. It's the way it works. But I try to get it done, and then as the semester, comes to a conclusion, we switch to 1 chapter most weeks, or every week. That way, we are able to make the work a little bit lighter. I know a lot of classes you have, big group projects and papers. I know that in most of the classes I teach, there's a lot going on right at the end of the semester. So I do try to lighten the load a little bit towards the end of the semester. So that's why we've had 2 chapters almost every week up until now. So this is the last week with 2 chapters though. So maybe that's good news. All right, so let's take a look back at some of your questions from last week. What could you possibly get if you've experienced or been involved in a bait and switch? It's a great question. It's one for a lawyer, but it really depends on how can you prove it was bait and switch, and then what were your actual damages. If you were, if you figured this out before there were actually any damages, what can you get? Probably nothing. But again, if you've been involved in something like this and you've experienced damages, it's definitely something that's worth talking to a lawyer about. All right. Should bait and switch be considered false advertisement? It absolutely is. Let's see here, looking through. So implied warranty and regular warranty, those are, I hope that the further lectures last week made sense of that. If not, send me a email and we'll talk about it. How can a seller use a product once and be within the guidelines? Seems unfair. That's the government rules. In a lot of times, we talk about, well, why is it like this? Well, that's what government said it was. And then who makes that government? Well, elected officials. So if you don't like it, complain to your elected officials. You'd be surprised how often that does have an impact. It's been amazing how much Twitter has an impact, even with a very small minority of the population, very small segment of the population uses Twitter actively, but because of how people perceive it, Twitter has been a very, and many social media areas have been a way to encourage social change and change in government rules and stuff like that. All right, let's see here. What big difference in federal regulations can we notice between a state to other? I'm sorry, I'm not quite understanding your question, so follow up with me on an email if you have any questions about that. Let's see here. Bunch of no's. All right, let's move forward. All right, so I put the one video in there, the cartoon video, and I think a lot of people, it's different, right? It's not me lecturing, it's not some boring lecture, so helping might have helped. Maybe that video helped, and high school never taught things about warranties. Yeah, it's one of those things that I really wish that everyone learned more about, as just part of their education. I think I talked about this last week or maybe the week before. Where does some learning need to happen? Should it happen in college? Should it happen in high school? And the reality is, if it's something that everyone should know, because not everyone goes to college, it should happen in high school. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen, and then people are out there and not quite understanding everything that applies to them when they're out doing real world stuff. All right, so what would have happened if there was never an antitrust act? That's a really interesting question. Probably if you look back at when it was created, there were a couple monopolies that were immediately broken up, mostly around oil, rail, and early technology. Alexander Graham Bell and his companies had a monopoly on phones and telegraphs. They probably, if they were never broken up, they would probably own all technology now. A couple people would own, or a couple companies would own all of the transportation services in the U.S. So it would be very different. It's hard to imagine what it would have been like. All right. What happened to the unions after they tried to break them up? Were they fined or imprisoned? So, unions, depending on when you're talking about what's going on in the world, there are people and companies who are pro-union and people or companies who are anti-union. I've worked in both union and non-union shops, and I will say there's benefits and drawbacks of both. Neither is perfect. So right now it's looking like in some cases Starbucks is unionizing while Amazon is moving away from unions. So it's interesting. There's multiple takes on this, so it's hard to answer. All right. I think I already answered that one there. Are all businesses regulated through the federal government? Probably. I would say maybe there are a few businesses out there who don't deal with federal regulations and only deal with state regulations, but I can't come up with an example of it right now. So probably, yeah, there's federal regulations that are involved in almost every single business. How did the government regulate businesses that was not in the public interest? Well, I would say there are plenty of businesses out there that aren't in the public business that we regulate now, right? There are many things out there. I'm gonna pick on alcohol. Alcohol, generally, when consumed in excess, not good for people. Do I consume alcohol? Absolutely. But would it be like better for people's health if we just banned all alcohol? We tried it once. It didn't work very well, but it could happen. Could you ban things that are unsafe and unhealthy? Yeah. And basically, like, alcohol is a great example. Government regulations went too far according to the people. So a group of people said, let's ban alcohol. Created a constitutional amendment. Lasted less than a decade. Everyone broke the law, and then they got rid of it. So it's interesting how the pendulum swings back and forth on this, right? When's the most recent time this act? So I'm antitrust stuff. So and enforced. There have been a couple companies that have been broken up in the 80s. But right now, they're looking at, does Facebook or Meta need to be broken up? Does Google need to be broken up? Do some of the giant tech companies need to be broken up? It's a good question. I have a feeling some of these tech companies have gotten so big that eventually there are antitrust lawsuits against them now. Will they be broken up? I would say probably in some cases in the future, right? Is there a specific law in place breaking up monopolies? Yep. Does the government benefit from monopolies? So maybe. If you only have to deal, like, so government, if there are multiple companies out there, sometimes you have to make multiple rules and you're dealing with multiple different parties and multiple different interests. So it's easier if you have one. It's usually generally worse for the consumer to have one. Like, we all hate the cable company because there's only one in an area, right? Now that there's more competition with Dish and some of these other things, these monopolies are now having to have competition when they used to not. So it's an interesting concept. So yeah. All right. WD-40. It is. Technically it's a cleaner, but most people use it as a lubricant. It comes in a spray can. You spray it on like door hinges and stuff. All right. I think I've answered some of the Sherman antitrust acts. Is the act still used? Yes. Let's see. I think I answered those. I think I answered all of that here. So why are unions allowed in the North but not in the South? That is generally not true. So there are some northern states that are more unionized than others. The Midwest, the old, when we talk about the old industrial area, we call it the Rust Belt now, where there's a lot of huge industry. Basically, if you go from like New York through Chicago and kind of go through that area of the country, it's where most industry was. And that unionized very heavily. But there are unionized plants in North Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Florida, Texas, and there are non-unionized plants in, Chicago, New York, Pittsburgh, whatever. And really, part of it's cultural, part of it's, leftovers, part of it, some places see a benefit more than others from being in a union. Me personally, I did not like working in the union environment I worked in. Is it because it might have been just that union or that environment? But yeah. It's not a North versus South thing by any means. There are more employment at will states in the South. Not all of them. There are employment at will states up north, and it doesn't mean what a lot of people generally think it means. It just means that you can join any union. You're not forced into one union. Yeah. All right. What made the Sherman Antitrust Act so ineffective? It has to be run through government. and government sometimes is in effect, right? So the Sherman Antitrust Act was there just to break up monopolies. All right, moving on. So I'm not going to go through all the discussions, but there are many good examples about companies that are, involved in trust or antitrust ideas and regulations. It's continuously going out there. I love, I make these videos up. I made an alcohol reference, and then the first one I look at when I start reading this is about alcohol, right? Non-competitive monopolies can happen in any industry, and sometimes it just happens because somebody like one company's just so good at something they move everybody out. Like if Coke were to buy Pepsi or Pepsi were to buy Coke, there's very few other people who make soft drinks. So there's two big companies out there. There's a lot of little companies, but there's two big companies out there that do that. Yeah, so good examples. For the most part, you all have gotten into a good rhythm and understanding. The grades look like they'll be, I haven't graded them yet, but they look like they'll be, they're not all done yet, but they look like they'll be better than in weeks previous. So if you have any questions about your grade, take a look at the rubric. There's always grade on the rubric. And then if you have questions about that, let me know. I'll be happy to help you improve your grades, or maybe I clicked the wrong button. That happens sometimes too. All right, so that's it. That's all I'm going to talk about in the looking back video. Let's take a look at the lecture videos and we'll move forward.